This is The Gay Adventure, a romance by Richard Byrd, a work in the public domain. Chapter 14. Arise INTHE world. The Happy Heart was an ideal resting place for a tired man, whether town or country. Bred. To the former, it made the stronger appeal, for there could be no greater contrast than between the Happy Heart and the flaring, brazen public houses which offer solace to the dwellers of the pavement. These attract by their fierce pledges of light, warmth, and the stimulated oblivion of the moment. The Happy Heart draws the heart, strings alike of the physically tired and mentally jaded. Apart from the promise of good liquor, and all who go to Sherilyn can rely on the promise being fulfilled, it makes an aesthetic appeal. For it is still an old-fashioned country tavern of the prettiest type, destined to make even the total abstainer wonder whether he be so absolutely in the right after all. It boasts a porch, over which a Virginia creeper spreads its amorous leaves, rose bushes waft a welcome, and the sure hope of peace to ploughman or golfer after the day's striving. A meditative cow, apparently an artistic fixture, chews the cud in a field hard by from day to day. Smoke curls lazily from a huge and ancient chimney, as much as to say, "Be of good cheer, I come from the kitchen." And there is, too, one of those signposts you see sometimes in the South, a pillar placed separate from the inn itself with a swinging board above. The superscription, by the way, was due to the fancy of the squire's wife. When the squire entered into his inheritance and married, he had had dreams. He wished to be like Dogberry and have everything handsome about him. His wife, a pretty imaginative creature, had imbued him with ideas for the betterment of his dependents, and he had tried to fulfill her wishes. He inclined to the practical side, and to him was due at least half the credit for the improved housing and sanitation of Sherilyn. She, practical enough, thought that aestheticism should show an equal growth, and to her shade the visitor does reverence when he admires the profuse planting of trees, the village library with its good pictures, the addition of a tower to the church, and a fine organ. Last, but not least, she persuaded her husband to have the inn called the Happy Heart instead of the Bull and Dog. In this desirable residence, Tony and Robert Hedderwick sat at 2 o'clock, enjoying their cigars after a copious lunch. Robert had slept the whole morning and now felt a new man. Tony was tired, but disinclined for bed. There had been too much to interest him up to the present, and he felt there might be more to come. This was such a new sensation that he had no trouble in propping his eyelids till the evening, and he listened with zest while Robert prattled cheerfully of his incredible adventures. They had, of course, agreed to work as partners. So long as tedium kept away, they were mutually attracted and already more than friendly. Confidences had been exchanged. Tony had repeated to the envious churchwarden some of the tamer episodes of his dilettante existence. Robert had tried to cap them with his burglars and Alicia. "But you ought to let your wife know something," suggested Tony. "She may be worrying." The churchwarden looked a little uneasy. "If I write I might be traced by the postmark," he objected. "I suppose I might send a letter saying I'm all right to a friend and get him to readdress it, but even then there's a danger." "There's danger anyway," said Tony, smoking thoughtfully. "From what you tell me, I should think Mrs. Hedderwick would not hesitate to use detectives if she thought it necessary. I should hardly think it would be long before they picked up your trail, unless you communicate with her. Really, you know—" He broke off suddenly and laughed. "No, don't write. I've got a better plan. I won't tell you now, but keep it for a little, till a dull hour comes and we are hard up for something to do." Robert, naturally curious, begged for enlightenment, but Tony was adamant. Changing his ground, he declared that there was no hurry for a day or two, or at least for a few hours. Mrs. Hedderwick would probably take a couple of days to make up her mind to use the police, and meanwhile they were better employed in seizing the thrills of the moment. Tony got his way, of course. He was accustomed to lead and exact obedience. Personality and class, consciousness, coupled with a humour that appealed to his victims, made the task easy. "I haven't told you yet," said he, after silencing Robert's objections, "what I did with my morning. Well, I looked round and got the general hang of the village. More, I followed our mysterious friend, let's call him Billy, and from a distance saw him enter the quiet house. Queer place that, by the way. Surrounded by a brick wall 10 feet high. Couldn't get a glimpse inside except through a gate. The landlord tells me that he hasn't booked a bed here, so it looks either as if he meant to leave Sherilyn or stay at the quiet house." "A good job too," commented Robert. "It wouldn't do for him to see me. Of course I should be recognised at once, and that would make him suspicious." Quite so, agreed Tony. If he hung about here, you'd have to stay in bed all day. Rather a depressing prospect when fun is promised. But if I were you, I'd give a false name to the landlord. If Billy heard of Mr. Heatherwick, it would make him think of things. Robert had an instinctive repugnance to the plan. In some obscure way it savoured of criminality, and the shackles of convention were still not wholly broken. But in the end Tony again triumphed, and the blameless Heatherwick was dubbed Bangs. He did not particularly care for the choice, but as Tony said he looked the perfect essential Bangs and that any other name would be unthinkable, Robert gave way. "Oh, and I saw someone else," continued Tony when the point was settled. "A remarkably pretty girl. She too entered the quiet house, some time after Billy. I had seen him safely in, and was waiting by the roadside when she came along. She snubbed me, quite properly, but was kindly careless enough to drop a card. It bore the name of Miss Arkwright, who, I understand, owns the quiet house. But somehow I don't feel sure that the card is hers." "Why?" "Dunno," said Tony with a dissatisfied air. "I haven't any reasonable evidence. A kind of intuition, I suppose, more than anything else. Somehow she doesn't look an Arkwright. She hasn't got an Arkwright personality. Now, you simply exude Bangs at every pore. You're all right. What was she like?" "Bangs being a respectable married man, mere good looks have no interest for him." "Oh, but they have," interrupted Robert with a naif eagerness. "Well, they oughtn't to, then. As a matter of fact, she was deucedly pretty, and, good Lord—" He broke off and jumped to his feet in a listening attitude. Robert did the same, for in the porch they heard the voice of Lionel, or Billy, as they had named their anonymous friend, in conversation with the landlord. The two men were discussing the weather, and Tony and his partner looked frantically at each other for a plan. In another minute Lionel might enter the parlour, and there was no escape. The door was but a yard distant from the porch, the window opened on the road. To leave the room by either egress might mean discovery, and for Robert to be recognised by Lionel would ruin all. That is, it might effectively put an end to the development of the adventure, for if Billy's suspicions were awakened, he might take the first train back to town. At least he would be put on his guard, and that would make things more difficult than ever. It was imperative that Robert should be hidden from sight. But where? He could not be concealed under the table, for no cloth lay upon it, drooping decorously over the edges. There was no cupboard large enough to contain the bulk of Bangs. No friendly screen, the time-honoured refuge of the dramatist, stood in any corner. No Falstaffian basket was there to promise aid. The room was a Sahara in view of the unhappy arrival of Billy, and beads of perspiration stood out on Robert's brow as he waited, without a plan, helpless as a trapped rabbit. Tony's friends used sometimes to complain that he put them in impossible situations. The charge was not unjust, but, as Tony would point out when accused, he was equally ready to sacrifice himself if circumstances demanded it. It was unfortunate, no doubt, that fate seemed to prefer the immolation of a friend, but that was not his fault. It was fate who should be reviled. This was an occasion calling for presence of mind, resource, and unflinching discipline. If the adventure of his life was to be carried through successfully, no minor considerations, such as friendship or soot, could be allowed to weigh. With a strong gesture, he pointed to the old-fashioned hearth and capacious chimney. "Up you go," he whispered. "Look sharp." And Robert recoiled. "No, no," he whispered piteously. "Not that, surely." He was not allowed to argue. In another moment Robert felt himself led, as in a dream, to the fireplace. The next, and he had a foot upon the massive iron bars. Luckily there was no fire laid, no coal to disturb and proclaim his bid for obscurity. He looked up into the cavernous darkness and groaned in spirit. That was the first time he regretted his mad flight. Then, helping himself by projecting bricks, searching for insecure crevices with his toes, he began to climb the few feet necessary to safety. By the time his ankles were the only visible evidence, the hearth was covered with soot, and Tony looked anxiously round for something to remove it. As chance would have it, a broom stood in the corner of the parlour, left there by a careless servant after the morning's tidy-up. Triumph in his eye, Tony seized it and approached the hearth. But on getting there his purpose changed. Temptation was too strong. Pushing the broom up the chimney, he used it as one uses a ramrod, helping the murmurous Robert in his upward path. "Excelsior, old friend," whispered Tony, for an ankle could still be seen. "Excelsior!" And he thrust with frenzy. The only response was a muffled sound that floated down, a subdued kind of blasphemous choke. It filtered into the parlour as "org," but Tony did not relax his efforts till the ankle had disappeared. The next moment Lionel entered the room, followed by the landlord. The latter gave an astonished grunt as he surveyed Tony, hands and face smudged like a Christie minstrel, and even Lionel's breeding found it hard to restrain a laugh. "There has been a fall of soot, Mr. Glue," observed Tony blandly. "I found this broom and was just going—" "Law, sir, don't you trouble," said Glue, scandalised that a guest could so demean himself. "The servant'll do that presently. I was just saying to the missus a week ago come Thursday that we should have to get our chimneys clean soon. We'll have to set about it in earnest now, and no mistake." "I suppose you send over to Dallingham for a sweep," suggested Lionel, sitting down. The landlord chuckled. "Yes, sir, when the squire's at home. He makes us. But when he's abroad, why, we do the old-fashioned way, light a batten of straw and burn the flue clear." A slight scuffle proceeding from the chimney seemed to hint that Mr. Bangs had heard. Could it be that he feared lest they were going to clean the flue in the old-fashioned way now, or was he merely suffering from cramp? Whichever it was, he shifted. The noise was unmistakable, and the fall of more soot made the landlord shake his head. "I doubt there's a bird got down the chimney," he said, scratching his chin. "Those jackdaws or young rooks do sometimes. Give me the broom, sir, and I'll soon have him down." Tony's hand tightened on the broom. "Let me," he said suavely. "There's no need for two people to get black." Without waiting for a reply, he approached the fireplace and thrust his weapon strenuously aloft. It was no time for half measures, and Tony felt obliged to be as realistic as possible in the interests of his friend. Realism, however, may be carried to excess, as Mr. Bangs pointed out later with no little heat, and the fluttering of the mythical bird would have drawn tears to the eyes of humanitarians. "It's no good, sir," said the landlord, dismally observing the soot. "It's out of reach. I fancy I'd better get that straw and ha' done with it." "That's rather too cruel, landlord," said Lionel from his seat. "I don't like the idea of smothering the poor beast." "Put it this way, sir," said Glue, who was an amiable fellow. "Is it better to smother it or leave it there to starve?" "My way you'd take 5 minutes, yours a couple of days. Well, sir." "I suppose you're right," said the soft-hearted Lionel, "but I don't half like—" "Don't you worry," struck in Tony, who was beginning to get anxious. "I tell you what, it's a big chimney and I'm pretty slim. If you'll let me go up tonight after the pub's closed, Mr. Glue, I'll strip and climb. Of course we mustn't leave it there, and smothering doesn't appeal to me." "You're a decent chap," said Lionel, moved to admiration. Tony modestly murmured, "Not at all," and hoped the landlord was satisfied. But he was not. The very idea. One of his guests a-climbing the chimney. No! He'd send the boy up. Hi! Things were now looking very black in more than one sense, and the disciple of romance in the chimney had serious thoughts of a descent. But as the landlord opened his mouth to bellow for the boy, the man from upstairs, Mr. Beckett, passed the door with his golf club slung over his shoulder. He looked in and said, "I'm going up to the links, Mr. Glue." "Dinner at 7:30, please," in a polished voice that carried a hint of an alien accent. Then he went on. Helio determined to follow. He had been to the quiet house that morning and had learned that Miss Arkwright was away. She would be back, however, about 4. The door had been answered by the dumb footman spoken of by the vicar, who had exhibited one of those dials that stand on hall tables. Out in at. So Lionel had come back, meaning to kill a couple of hours at the inn. But when he saw the man Beckett, it struck him that he might as well waste those hours on the links. He might possibly get into conversation with this man, whom he felt sure was the Turkish ambassador. Everything pointed to it, the newspaper paragraph, the accent, the assumed name, for he had confessed it to the vicar, the age. Supposing this to be so, he might be worth watching. If Beatrice were right in her suspicions and conjectures, it was quite possible Mizzy would follow him to Shereling and seek an interview. Mizzy, in point of fact, might have already made an assignation. She might even be waiting on the links. Supposing he found them. Well, at least he would have verified suspicions, and could chart his course by certain knowledge. Yes, he would follow on the off chance. It did not take as long to make up his mind as we have taken to describe it. The reader, if kindly-hearted, should be glad of this, for meanwhile the unhappy Bangs has risked exceeding the proverbial allowance of a peck of dirt to be swallowed in a lifetime. Lionel then went out, leaving Tony to deal with the landlord. He sighed with relief, for at least the most important character had disappeared. "Mr. Glue," he said winningly, "I have a little surprise for you. May I close the door for a moment?" "Certainly, sir," said the other, staring, His bovine gaze followed Tony as he walked to the fireplace, stooped down and said gently, "Come, birdie, come," a song of his childhood flitting suddenly across his brain. To make his meaning perfectly clear, he added, "It's all right, Bangs, you may get down from the table." Then he discreetly retired a few paces and waited. He had not to wait long. "My Gord," said the landlord explosively, and indeed there was excuse for the expression. It was caused by the extraordinary entrance of Mr. Bangs. He clambered down painfully for a few feet, but just as he reached the bottom his foot slipped, and he sat down emphatically, facing them in the grate. The appearance of this gnome, silent, save for a strange wheezing that rasped its way through a soot-slaked windpipe, baffled description. Tony looked at the figure with a mournful compassion, and the landlord rocked drunkenly against the door. "You see, Mr. Glue," said Tony soothingly, "it happened like this. My friend, who, I am sure, will corroborate me as soon as he has had a drink, my friend and I had a dispute about chimneys. He averred that they often concealed a priest's hole, one of those hiding places for popish priests we read about. I disagreed, and our dispute became so heated that we even staked money. Mr. Bangs on the probable existence of such a chamber here, I on the negative side. He is an enthusiast, and nothing would content him but the immediate settlement of the question. So, despite my protests, up he climbed. Just as he was about to descend, you and the other gentleman entered. Conceive the position. He naturally had no wish to be discovered in such a situation, and waited, hoping the parlour would soon be empty. Your suggestion of the baton upset all calculations. Now, I am sure you will spare his feelings and say nothing of this. All he requires is a hot bath. You quite understand?" The landlord gave a crow of assent. But as he went down the passage, a deep rumbling, suppressed but distinct, betokened that he could not regard the situation seriously. When the door was closed, Tony turned apologetically to his companion, in arms. "Awfully sorry, old chap," he said, "but it was one of those things that had to be. You quite see that, I hope?" "Croaks," said the gnome, weeping. "Croaks, ebb croaks." Chapter 15. A change OF lodging. At the clubhouse, Lionel put his name down for a week's membership, thinking it might be useful. He learned from the local professional in the course of a short chat that there were only some half-dozen players out that afternoon, all being men. Mizzy, therefore, had not assumed the disguise of a golfer, though she might be waiting somewhere on the horizon at an appointed trysting place. The ambassador drove from the first tee while they were talking. He was playing a solitary game against Bogey, who, judging from the first 3 shots, appeared likely to win. The fact that he did not take a caddy might mean anything. A sense of shame, or an expected meeting with Mizzy. Lionel, that he might have a reasonable excuse for keeping him under observation, borrowed some clubs from the pro. On the plea that his own had not yet arrived. He had not played golf for years, but trusted that some of his ancient skill might still remain, enough at least to justify his appearance on the links. The scheme, however, produced little, for there was no sign of Mizzy. Lionel played slowly, keeping a methodical hole behind all the way. At the 15th, however, he caught up with his quarry. In a moment of ill-judged enthusiasm, and fired by the thrill of a superlative brassy shot, he went all out for his 3rd. It was a long hole, bogey 5, and there was a deep bunker guarding the green. Lionel, after some consideration, took the mashie in preference to the iron. It was a mistake, for the green was farther than he thought. He made a beautiful full shot that flew straight, but fell short, deep in the heart of the bunker. "Spoilt it," thought Lionel with natural melancholy. "Ah, well, not so bad, considering I haven't played for so long." As he walked on, he remembered with a pang that he had forgotten the ambassador. In the pleasure excited by a perfect drive, a perfect brassy shot, and an ill-fated, ill-judged, but clean full mashie, he had lost sight of the other's existence. Now he was nowhere to be seen. "Confound it," thought Lionel uneasily. "What a kid I am to get carried away by the game. Has he holed out and gone on, or is he by any chance in that bunker?" He hurried forward, now thinking only of the chase, and as he drew nearer, he heard curious sounds proceeding from the grave of so many hopes. Voluble, emphatic, and distinct utterance in an alien tongue floated through the abashed ether, and with a sigh of relief, Lionel approached and stood on the brink of the pit. It was a deep, sandy hollow, shored up on the farther side with stout banks of timber, and at the bottom stood the ambassador cursing his ball. So intent was he on this futile but human act that he did not observe his audience above. Lionel stood and watched, not ill-pleased that an aged arbiter of the peace of nations could on occasion show some feeling, real if regrettable. Presently, the exasperated diplomat ceased his objurgations, swung his niblick once more, and tried to get out. He struck once, and the ball bounded heartily against the timbers, falling back at his very feet. He smote again, and a shower of stinging sand whipped sharply in his face. "We," he said distinctly, and Lionel's cheek tingled in sympathy. He swung a third time, and with neat precision played a flint stone well on the green, laying it dead. Being a man of obvious determination, though limited skill, he tried again, and yet once more. Then, with uncouth barbaric cries, which Lionel rightly guessed to be in the Turkish language, he lashed flail-wise at the ball. It rolled, leaped, hopped, grew vivid with excitement, but still it never left the bunker. He gave it up at last. This cunning diplomat, this indomitable statesman, was obliged to own himself defeated. Picking up the ball, he deliberately took a knife from his pocket and tried to cut it in half. This proving impossible, he flung it away, resolved that never more should he be troubled with this particular disturber of the peace. Then, with a resolute, quiet action, he broke his niblick across his knee. Lionel, hoping to get into conversation, left his eyrie and joined him in the pit. "My turn now, sir," he said with a fictitious cheerfulness. "I hoped the green was 20 yards closer. This is a beastly place to get out of." It was a false move. Had he waited till the other had done a hole in 3, or at least made one good approach, Lionel might have found him good-humoured, conversational, entertaining. But at the moment he was not himself, with a contemptuous "Aleo diabol." The ambassador looked sourly on Lionel and climbed slowly up the hill. Lionel, disappointed but not resentful, watched him drive from the next tee. He followed him round without result, and in the fullness of time saw him leave the golf-house and walk dejectedly home. After watching him enter the Happy Heart, Lionel made his way peacefully to the quiet house, hoping Miss Arkwright would have returned. In this he was not disappointed, for the silent footman bowed in answer to his question and held the door invitingly open. Lionel accepted the unspoken welcome, entered, and was shown into the drawing-room. The footman placed a chair and motioned that he should sit down. Lionel obeyed with a vague feeling that something was amiss. Was it the silence of the footman that gave him an uncanny impression, or was it the atmosphere of the house? He had heard of presentiments of ill under similar circumstances and had disbelieved them all, but now it was different. He was uneasy. After sitting uncomfortably in his chair, half expecting it to play some goblin trick upon him, he got up and began to look at a picture hanging above the mantelpiece. He was still busy with his scrutiny when he heard the door open and close again behind him. Turning at the sound, he saw a lady standing perfectly still in the middle of the room. Lionel gasped and almost fell. "You!" he quavered, sure now that wizardry was at work. "You!" "Please sit down," said a grave voice. "I am Miss Arkwright." Lionel pulled himself together with an effort, but he did not sit down. "No," he objected steadily, "I am sorry to contradict you, but that is not true. You are playing a trick on me for some reason that I cannot understand. But I swear that you are not Miss Arkwright." The lady smiled as one who soothes a maniac. "Indeed?" she said courteously. "Then perhaps you will tell me who I am." "You are Miss Beatrice Blair," said Lionel in a hard voice. He was bitterly disappointed, and no wonder. "Beatrice Blair?" repeated the other, with an astonishment that could not but be genuine. "Whom do you mean? Who is Beatrice Blair?" "She was playing last night at the Macready Theatre," returned Lionel with a patient dignity. "How she contrives to be at Sherling at this hour, mystifying a poor wretch whose only fault is a too ardent devotion, I cannot explain." This he thought rather a fine speech, and he was relieved to see the clearing of her brow. But he was mistaken as to the cause. "The Macready Theatre!" cried the lady in a tone of satisfaction. "Ah, I can guess now. You must mean my sister, of course. There can be no other explanation. I know she is," she shuddered daintily, "an actress, but I had quite forgotten her nom de guerre." "Her sister?" repeated Lionel dully. "Why, yes, I thought I was calling on her sister. I wish to see her, not Miss Blair again." He sat down, unable to realize it yet. "Did you not know we were twins?" she asked, clearly anxious to help him. "I had heard, but I did not expect. To find the resemblance so striking. I have not seen my sister for years, but when we were younger strangers often mistook us. We were mutual replicas. I imagine from your surprise that the resemblance is still very marked." "That is the feeblest way of putting it," he answered, still staring as if fascinated. You are identical in every feature, eyes, hair, even the voice. Perhaps you might find that we differ in disposition, in character, he interrupted brusquely, forcing himself to accept the incredible. Excuse me, but I cannot imagine anyone so perfect as Miss Blair. The lady sighed. She is on the stage. Good heavens, madam, said Lionel with scornful candour. Does the stage spell infamy to you? I thought that attitude was vieux jeu now. I may be old-fashioned, she said primly, but I am under few illusions. Of course, I would not even hint that my sister is likely to tread the downward path. Oh, Lord, he groaned in spirit, one of our family must have sufficient firmness of character to rise above even her environment. We know the old proverb of pitch and defilement. Can she honestly hope to retain her bloom unsullied? Have you ever, I won't say met an actor or actress, asked Lionel in polite wrath, but been to a theatre? Certainly. 3 pantomimes and our boys. But that is, how many years ago? It was a revival of the play, she said with a blush, and Lionel was glad to notice that she had at least one human trait. I am thankful to say that I did not laugh. And you rest your condemnation on that? He asked, disgusted that so pretty a creature could be so narrow. On that, on what I have been told, and on the ridiculous number of postcard favourites that I see, often in deplorable dishabille, in every stationer's shop. I have deliberately come to the conclusion that the stage is immoral. How, then, can I avoid condemning my sister's lamentable choice of a career? Lionel rose, pale with anger, forgetful of his errand. I am sorry to hear it, he said with absurd dignity. Of course he ought to have laughed and talked about the garden. I am sorry you persist in such a hasty condemnation of a noble profession, and of Miss Blair, she put in with a sly jealousy. If you like, he flung out, I cannot allow anyone, even you, to criticize her. I regret, therefore, that I shall not be able to stop the night. I was not aware, she said with an unmoved countenance, that I had given you an invitation. Lionel was so taken aback that he sat down abruptly in his chair. Then the humour of the situation came to his rescue, and he laughed outright. The lady, too, though she made a gallant effort to control herself, failed miserably. In a moment the pair of them were united by the most perfect bond, save one, that earth knows, the mutual appreciation of a jest. Lionel, as the waves of their mirth broke gently into ripples and presently dissolved in the foam of smiles, realized how foolish he had been. When he set out first for the quiet house he had taken it for granted that Beatrice had telegraphed to bespeak her sister's hospitality. It was only too clear now that she had not done this, either through forgetfulness, pressure of work, or procrastination. He had simply assumed that Miss Arkwright would receive him as her guest, and the conversation had been too briskly controversial to allow him to think. Now he was doubly annoyed at his clumsiness. He had behaved like a boor and had sacrificed the interests of Beatrice to an ill-timed chivalry. His cue was submission at all costs for Beatrice's sake. I apologize, he said with a frank good humour. I thought your sister had already engaged your good offices on my behalf. He noticed hopefully that Miss Arkwright's eyes still twinkled with amusement. Clearly she was not all prunes and prisms. I have heard nothing, said the lady much more sweetly. No doubt she meant to write, and forgot. Poor Beatrice, she was always harum-scarum. To a sensitive man this might have implied a lack of confidence in the protégée of Beatrice, and Lionel moved uneasily. I hope, he said humbly, that you will forgive me. I trust that you will allow me to prove my good faith. That I shall ask you to dine and sleep, she said bluntly, though a charming smile softened the crudity of her words. Well, Mr. Mortimer, Lionel Mortimer. Mr. Mortimer, I do not doubt your word for a moment. I should enjoy cultivating your acquaintance and hearing some first-hand news of my sister, but I fear it is impossible. You see, there are the proprieties to be considered. I am a single lady, and perhaps— To Lionel this was an astonishing view of the case. After his unconventional week at the Bloomsbury flat, he was poorly qualified to appreciate the apprehensions of Miss Arkwright. His brain told him idly that she was perfectly right, but his heart merely insisted on the abyss between her outlook and her sister's. And, as usually happens, the heart found the readier audience. Quite so, but surely you are old enough, she suggested helpfully, plunging him deeper. No, I did not mean that. I only meant that surely you have a housekeeper, some person of mature age, much older than yourself, who would save the situation. Well, she admitted with an exasperating coyness, I have such a domestic, it is true. Mrs. Weatherby, 60. Do you think that would do? Admirably, cried Lionel in triumph, caring nothing for his recent buffets. Admirably. Mrs. Weatherby shall protect you with the armour of a centurion or of a Lord Nelson, he added scrupulously, remembering that the pre-Dreadnought era would carry more conviction. The thing is arranged. I shall stay after all. Thank you, returned Miss Arkwright with a demure twinkle. Is she a prude? Oh, is she? He reflected, watching. Of course, I shall be delighted to do all I can for a friend of Beatrice. You really do know her? She asked in pretty appeal, as if frightened at her own rashness. If you like, said Lionel, luxuriously recalling his wonderful week, I shall paint a word, picture of her charms. I shall tell you how her eyes shame the starlight, how her hair can enmesh the hearts of all beholders, how her lips, I do not think I need trouble you, interrupted his hostess rather distantly. No doubt Beatrice is an attractive young person. Young person, he repeated, horror-struck. Beatrice Blair, a young person. Profanity. Please, please do not. I shall leave you to think of a better description, she said with a smile of pity that held no scorn. I have some letters to write, and I fear you will have to dine alone. You must excuse me, but it is inevitable. Do you mind ringing the bell? He obeyed, and a moment later the footman entered. Take this gentleman to the blue room, Forbes, said Miss Arkwright. See that he has everything he wants. The footman bowed and held the door open for Lionel. Dinner is at 7:30. If you are dull before then, please go to the library. But perhaps you are not a reader. Perhaps you are of those whose only books are, she checked herself, as if remembering her own correctness or the immobile Forbes. They taught me only wisdom, the best wisdom of all, said Lionel, answering the unfinished quotation. Then he went out, wondering. Chapter 16. A letter, A.N.D. Some Reflections. Bloomsbury, London. Dear Mr. Mortimer, long before this reaches you, my sister will have received a telegram introducing you properly. I am so sorry that I forgot to wire before, but I have been so harassed and busy that I never thought about it. A true woman, you will say. I can almost see your superior smile as I sit writing here, yet I dare to hope that the smile will not be too superior, that a touch of pity will creep in when you remember that my worry is for a husband's freedom. If only I can save Lucos, but it is foolish to waste time on ifs. I mean to succeed, and you have promised to help me. You have my heartfelt gratitude already. Thank you for your letter telling me of your arrival at the quiet house. Do not be discouraged that you have not seen Mizzy yet, and that you have been unable to approach the ambassador again. I have been working very hard and am not dissatisfied with the results, though they would look paltry if I committed them to paper. My information leads me to think that we are on the right track, that Mizzy is the guilty party, that sooner or later an attempt will be made to sell the document, and lastly, that we must suspect everyone. Yes, everyone. Even my sister, perhaps. And that brings me to the more important part of my letter. I have not seen Winifred for some years, but from the hints you gave me in your letter, I gather that she is of distinctly prepossessing appearance. Isn't that how the police reports usually describe it? My pen hesitates whether to write, "Be on your guard" or not. Shall I? May I? But it is written and must stand. Oh, do not imagine that I am distrustful. I know you can be relied on. I know you can be true and firm and faithful, but my heart fails when I remember that you are a man, encompassed, too, by perils you hardly perceive, snares almost impalpable. Forgive me. I have no right to speak like this. I know you are honourable, but the greatness of the stake forces me to utter my warning, to foresee danger which may be remote, to leave no stone unturned to ensure a triumph, to guard against any weakness, however venial or trivial, which may make my path, and the path of Lucos, more difficult. This is a rambling letter. It is midnight, and I have had a tiring day. Forgive me and understand, or, if you cannot understand, forgive. I urge you again to watch my sister carefully. Heavens, it seems a perfidy, but the life of Lucos, watch her, I say again. I have grave cause for suspicion, though she does not guess I suspect. Why she, above all others, should betray me I cannot tell. I had hoped that, but this is weak and futile. Watch her carefully. You say that up to the present nothing has happened. It may well be that nothing will happen for a time. In any case, you are of the greatest service by remaining at the quiet house, on guard. Stay there at all costs, till you hear from me again. Do what she tells you. Play the hypocrite if need be. Strive to conciliate her, but watch. I have London under my eyes. So much for the chief business. As for news, the play ceases very shortly, and I may be able to arrange a meeting when we can talk things over. On the whole, I am happy being busy. At least as happy as I can expect to be until... Oh, by the way, since we parted, I have had another offer of marriage, such a nice man too. But if only men could be satisfied with being true friends. Some men can, I know, but the rest. I am tired. Good night, my friend. Your friend, Beatrice Blair. Such was the letter that Lionel was reading for the 50th time since, a fortnight past, it had come to the quiet house. It gave him little information and less comfort. From the formal, "Dear Mr. Mortimer," hang it, I couldn't expect Lionel, he told himself savagely, to the distant intimacy of your friend Beatrice Blair. It was unsatisfying to a devoted adherent of romance. Yet what else could he ask for? He was not in love. No, he was not in love, for there was a husband. Besides, Beatrice would be the last person to lead him on when... Stay! There had been temptation on her part in the cab and in the dressing room. Yes, there had. There was no sense in pretending to himself that there had been no encouragement. There had. Charity, a word, by the way, which the revised version has altered to love, on the instant said, "Coxcomb. She led you on to engage your services for Lucos." A pardonable deception. Very well, grumbled Lionel, admitting the justice of the argument. Let it be so. But it seems a little rough on. Leaving this, he turned to other items, trying to read some new shades of meaning into the two well-remembered words. She was working hard. Good, she was fairly happy. Good, he must stay where he was. Good, watching. Good, Lucos, Lucos. Again Lucos, him. Yes, good, certainly good. The beggar was her husband after all. Good. The sister was pretty. A smile, he must be on his guard. Him, perfidy. A traitor of prepossessing appearance, could she be jealous? Coxcomb, said reason again. Look at the end, your friend. Such a nice man. Jealousy? Ha! Lionel swallowed the pill with a bad grace and put the letter away. He had been at the quiet house for a little more than a fortnight, and up to the present he had achieved nothing. Mizzy had made no sign, the ambassador was invisible, no further instructions had come from Beatrice. Yet he had been interested and amused, studying the character of his hostess and waiting, Micawber-like, for something to turn up. His position was the oddest conceivable. Since Beatrice's telegram, "She introduces you," said Miss Arkwright, "at the price of 5 and 3 pence. You must be an exceptional man." He had been more than a guest, almost an old acquaintance. He had been accepted without question, treated as an equal, hall marked with the stamp of an Arkwright's approval, because the Arkwrights, it appeared, prided themselves on their hospitality. It was not for the sake of Beatrice alone that he received so warm a welcome. She was a lady to be mentioned with reserve, being on the stage. But she was an Arkwright, and a guest vouched for, especially at 5 and 3 pence, by an Arkwright was a person to be considered. This at a price, and a curious price at that. In some things I am a faddist, Miss Arkwright had said the morning after his arrival. I admit it freely. I am glad to welcome you here, Mr. Mortimer, but if you stay you must give me your word not to go outside my grounds during your visit. The garden is large, the village uninteresting, so your curtailed liberty will not be much of a deprivation. You think me insane, perhaps? Well, I have reasons for my wish, personal reasons into which I cannot enter. That is the only stipulation I make. Can you accept it? He said yes, for refusal meant a lodging at the inn, where he could not watch her. In his letter to Beatrice he told her of this extraordinary whim, and asked whether she thought it better to agree or to pack up and go. Her stay at all costs was sufficient answer, and though he hoped this did not mean, if need arise, break bounds on your word, still he meant to do it if necessary. The life of Lucos and her happiness were worth more than a detective's honour. But up to the present there had been no question of breaking bounds. He could see nothing of Mr. Beckett, nor Mizzy, but he was obeying Beatrice. And it was not unpleasant, even for a detective, to enjoy luxurious idleness, a perfect garden, and the society of a charming woman. For she was charming, despite her fads and bigotry. She was well read, exceedingly pretty, and could talk. The morning she spent in writing and arranging her household affairs. After lunch she gave herself up to him entirely. Tea they usually had together in the summer house. About 5 she always excused herself, and Lionel dined alone. He was given to understand, that she was busy on a history of the Arkwright family and could work best at night. Consequently, he never saw anything of her again till breakfast. This naturally struck him as one of the most suspicious features of the case. Suspicious, not in the sense that Miss Arkwright was an Ottoman conspirator, for that he had been instructed to expect, but suspicious for a deeper reason. More than once during the first week of his stay, he had caught himself wondering, can she be by any chance Beatrice herself, masquerading as her own sister? It was a solution that suggested itself to a mind-seeking explanation of extraordinary things, extraordinary people. It was the most natural suspicion in the world, considering what he had gone through. He rejected it at first as being preposterous and disloyal, but common sense and a dislike of being victimized made him return to the idea and weigh it from day to day. In the end, he discarded the theory. It was, he thought, too enormous a deception to be carried through with success. Even Beatrice, actress though she was, could not have the histrionic powers necessary to the feat. Such a tour de force, continued from day to day, was impossible. Besides, Miss Arkwright and her sister were different in many points. They were, it is true, identical in voice, feature and carriage, but their outlook and ideas were far asunder. Winifred Arkwright obviously hated the stage, while Beatrice Blair was an actress. Winifred seemed timid in some respects. Beatrice radiated courage. The latter had never mentioned religion. The former was a Christian Scientist. Beatrice adored asparagus. Winifred's weakness was kidney beans. These, and 100 other variations, trivial in themselves but overwhelming in the mass, gave him heart of grace and a fresh faith in his lady of the stage. But despite all this, he claimed that Winifred might be Beatrice. It was almost unthinkable, but still it might be so. What gave the coup de grace, at least for a time, to his vain imaginings was a copy of the Times. It has been said that Miss Arkwright always left him after 5. This would have given her time to motor to London and play at the theatre if she had been Beatrice Blair. But Beatrice herself had written that the play was soon to be taken off. When he saw an announcement in the newspaper that the Macready Theatre was closed, he wondered if his hostess would join him at dinner that night. If she did, why, it would be a damning fact. But she did not, either on that or any subsequent day. He breathed more freely, and went on waiting as patiently as he might. The task of learning the house, grounds, and personnel did not take long. The servants were an aged cook, whom he never saw, a gardener, Forbes the footman, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Weatherby, a silent, faded woman of over 60, whose recreation outside her duties was the game of patience. A sad and oppressive creature, she, whose life had been a tragedy. The details were not given, though Lionel gathered that it had been a very ordinary tragedy, but enough to wither her life and make her shun her kind. Both the men servants were dumb, an odd circumstance, but Lionel was getting used to oddity. He expressed surprise one day, hoping to draw out his hostess. She was frank about the matter. They are dumb, poor creatures, but their affliction is my gain. Most servants gossip or argue. Mine do neither, and that is why I was at some pains to engage them. It works very well, though a stranger is naturally surprised at first. The more he saw of her, the more he admired. The primness of her attitude, when he began to know her better, struck him as being anything but ineradicable. She was in some things exceedingly human. They were talking one afternoon of Christian Science, and Lionel asked her if she really believed there was no such thing as pain. "Of course," she said promptly, "pain is merely ignorance." "Then you must admit," he said, "that there can be no pleasure." She was puzzled. "How so?" "Everything must have its foil. Good requires evil as its negative, or there is nothing. So to feel pleasure one must postulate pain, otherwise you are incapable of pleasure." "Oh, but I'm not," she said impulsively, and laughed. "Then where are your science and your logic?" "You mean I am a woman, and illogical," she parried, evading the dilemma. "When you understand our true position, you will realize how fallacious are your arguments. Now, what do you think of Pendennis?" He laughed again, but talked Thackeray willingly enough. When, a few moments later, she idly plucked a rose and pricked her finger on a thorn, giving a little cry, he said humorously, "Ignorance, not pain." She disdained to notice him, but smelt the rose luxuriously. "The illusion of pleasure," he suggested, pressing the thrust home. Her eyes sparkled with indignation, but he smiled into them unafraid. They were getting on capitally, he felt, and it was pleasant to find Miss Arkwright so much of a woman. She would pay for flirtatious treatment, he thought villainously, reflecting what a shame it was that lips so alluring should be unkissed. Lionel, you may have observed, was an adaptable creature. Fickle? Surely not. He had mapped his course and was steering strictly according to compass. While Beatrice was still a grass widow, the more innocent paths of dalliance showed no warning board. Trespassers will be prosecuted. They were not applauded, it is true, and here he readily confessed his weakness, but they were not forbidden. So why, in the strict execution of the charge laid upon him, may he not try to persuade Miss Arkwright to take a less frigid view of life? The reader, virtuous soul, may censure, I can only record. Yet, too, it was something in the nature of a drug to his conscience. When he had time to think, and he had plenty of time for that, he loathed the idea of being there under false pretences, playing the spy. It was all very well arguing that it was for the sake of Beatrice, but it would have been an easier task if Winifred had not been so charming. She was too charming, but it had to be done. Of course, he ought to have refused a hint of dalliance, but one step leads to another, and man is frail. Besides, it had not gone very far, not far enough to hurt either him or her. One mundane detail must be given in this chapter. The morning after his arrival, he had written to London for a supply of clothes. For the credit of the Blair side of the family, he felt that some of Beatrice's notes ought to be spent on an adequate wardrobe. They came the day after, giving colour to the excuse that his valet had got drunk and pawned the contents of his flat 2 hours after his leaving London. Miss Arkwright did not seem to think it strange. Anything might happen in that wicked city, but she considered the Homburg hat a little too continental. This was before her education had begun in earnest. Chapter 17. OFFWITHEOLD, love. It is all very well to be urged to suspect, for, within reason, nothing is easier. The world, in the process of our education, deals out so many hard knocks that speedily we begin to look with dubious eyes on every stranger. Sometimes, alas, even upon our friends. We suspect the motives of Smith, who recommends a first-rate cigar. Does he get a commission? We suspect Brown, who asks us to drop in any evening. Has he a marriageable daughter? Jones lauds the latest novel. Is he the anonymous author? Robinson advises the purchase of Consolidated Steamers. Is he trying to make us hold the baby? Suspicion is epidemic. What the world wants is a host of missionary spirits to say, for goodness sake do drop suspicion for a while and believe in your fellow man. Smith really does imagine himself a judge of tobacco. Brown, as a matter of fact, thinks you quite a pleasant chap, and his daughter is engaged. Jones never wrote a line in his life, save on a cheque, and Robinson for once has inside information. Give suspicion a rest. Ah, if only the other fellow would. Lionel had been told to suspect, and at first found the task no harder than you or I should find it. But apart from the strong inducement to forego suspicion, viz., the physical and mental attractions of Miss Arkwright, every day made it more difficult to sustain the suspicious attitude. The early surprises, the out-of-bounds rule, the dumb servants, the seclusion of his hostess and the like gave him plenty to wonder at, rich food for a seeker of garbage. But usage made the odd seem ordinary, and Miss Arkwright always had an explanation. The servants had already been accounted for. The prohibition of the village might be a whim, though of course he was not satisfied with this. Her own seclusion, he guessed, from a hint here and there, was due to a disappointment in early youth. But it was really custom that staled the infinite variety of the first surprises. He had to accept the routine of the quiet house, and could not be expected to whip up a daily supply of suspicions. One can imagine, perhaps, a Jew in a medieval baron's dungeon waking peacefully and asking his jailer, "What is it today, Cedric?" "A tooth out? The strappado? Or the rack? Just a tooth? Good." The analogy is anything but exact, for Lionel did not get a succession of thrills. The daily wonder as to why she forbade him the village, why she did not receive any local god, parson, squire, or doctor, why she did this or that, dwindled imperceptibly. He did not consciously relax. He had to adjust himself to the new conditions, but the effort at adjustment grew less laborious, and soon was in some danger of ceasing altogether. Not that he abandoned his vigilance. Beatrice had enjoined him with unnecessary and vain repetition to watch her sister. He gladly obeyed. The English language is susceptible of many interpretations, and who could dogmatize on the precise value to be attached to the word watch? Lionel watched all the time, but his watching at the end of a fortnight was very different from the early vigils. He learned nothing from watching, save that Winifred Arkwright was a delightful creature, with hair of such and such a colour and softness, eyes of such and such a sweetness, and so forth. Things, you observe, of no importance from Lucco's point of view, though a chronicler is bound to state them, however briefly. They became good friends. There was no hint of boredom on either side, no suggestion that the visit was being prolonged a little queerly. Lionel, you may be sure, did not offer to go. He was obeying Beatrice, who had not written again, though he sent a daily bulletin to London, and was in no hurry to study fresh characters. There was no ill reward of virtue to find a replica of Beatrice, to keep his devotion alive. A brutal phrase, too brutal. His devotion was there, hidden below the surface, but necessarily quiescent as long as Lucco's lived. That might be for years, therefore. Why not sun himself in Beatrice's rays by proxy? A statue can partly compensate for the loss of an adored, even a photograph is better than nothing. But a real woman, a living replica, Lionel thought himself in luck. He mentioned this in one of his letters, hoping to show how strong and faithful he was. He did not mention it to Winifred. Even a lay figure has feelings. A lay figure, was she merely that? The question came to him more than once during that peaceful fortnight. He faced it without a blush, and up to the present had always been able to give an affirmative answer. His memory of Beatrice and the unnecessary warning in her letter enabled him to watch, admire, and lightly dally with the rose-weaved chains. He laughed at the warning. He was a man, of course, and no stronger than his fellows, but fancy being in danger of falling in love with Miss Arkwright. In love, real, genuine love, absurd. Why, he was not in love with Beatrice. Was he? No, no, he was a free man, hurrah! At the end of 10 days he could utter the mental hurrah with a braver note. Beatrice was a darling whom he hoped to see again soon. But in love? No. In love with Miss Arkwright, then? In his mind he now called her Winifred. No. Of course not. Absurd. Was she not a lay figure? Stay. That was hardly the choicest of expressions, hardly respectful or considerate. She was a delightful lady whom it was his painful duty to watch, but one must not speak of her as a lay figure, that is crude, elementary, containing a grain of truth, one admits, but likely to be misinterpreted by the vulgar herd. A peerless proxy would be more in keeping. And the proxy, what of her? How had she fared during her unusual fortnight? Patently anything but ill. Under the sun of Lionel's sympathetic kindliness, her virgin coldness melted. They talked together on every subject. Men and women, books, art, music. Their views often clashed, but interest is sustained by conflict. Complete agreement makes conversation a superfluity. Their conversation rarely descended to small talk, though more than once it became almost a quarrel. A quarrel of friends, be it understood. A quarrel that left no bitterness behind, but made the next meeting more stored with interest, explanation, withdrawal, even partial conversion. Their chief debatable country was the stage, and at last Lionel had the happiness of winning the admission that the stage had possibly improved of recent years. A great admission for her. He paid his debt handsomely by a promise to read a book, 537 pages, 8 volumes, on Christian Science. She gave him the book next day. Alas, it now reposes in the present historian's drawer, the leaf still innocent of the paper knife. So a pretty comradeship sprang up between a cloistered lady and an illegible worldling. The latter had never a penny, had not so long ago vowed himself to the service of another, declared upon his honour that his heart was no one's, lived for the moment on a false-won hospitality. What would be the end of such a revolting character? A queer sort of hero, in very truth, but the world is an asylum of lunatics seeking happiness by a host of roads. You who condemn the road of Lionel are asked to remember the stony paths he had trodden without complaint. Let him settle any difficulties of conscience for himself, and be not too hasty in your judgments. Let him at least have his fortnight of so-called happiness. If it be not in accordance with your ideas of the summum bonum, remember that it is not his. A fortnight in an oasis need not be grudged when the desert lies behind and before. If he has not learned wisdom, you may be sure that he will ere long. Rub your hands, gentlemen, and look forward to a rare feast of disillusion and disenchantment. Possibly there may be an exposure, disgrace, even a prison if we are lucky and have patience. And if you can spare a little pickle for the rod, be good enough to pass it up. As for the other characters in this rural comedy, or melodrama if you prefer it, their lives have been equally uneventful during the last fortnight. Tony Wilde and Mr. Bangs are still occupying rooms at the Happy Heart, chafing at the lack of events. They have allowed it to be understood that they are on a holiday, seeking peace. I have thoroughly explored the neighbourhood and failed to find a hint of interest in any of the Shereling inhabitants. Even the taproom yokels have not produced a stimulating curiosity, and higher society is lacking in the village. The squire is away, and medical and legal needs, it appears, are supplied from Dallingham. There is Mr. Beckett, it is true, but he plays golf, spending the rest of his time in his bedroom, repulsing all overtures of friendship. There is the vicarage, of course, and Mrs. Peters has been prevailed upon to invite them to dinner, for the vicar is a friendly soul, anxious to make the most of the social crumbs dropped rarely in his path. Tony and Robert have dined there, and been round 2 or 3 times to smoke a pipe and inspect the roses. But Mrs. Peters does not diffuse an atmosphere of comfort, and the vicar himself is an exhausted fountain after an hour. A kindly, cheerful little man, but 60 minutes' prattle is as much as Tony can bear. Robert might find a longer period congenial, but he is perpetually ill at ease under his cognomen of Bangs, fearful of betraying himself, inclined to blush without apparent cause. Indeed, if it were not for Tony, Robert might have given up the pursuit already. Not that he means to go back home as yet. Liberty is still precious, and adventures, or at least unfettered repose, may be sought at Brighton or Eastbourne before he returns to nonentity. But is it worth while waiting at Shereling, where the mysterious Billy is never seen, where the remembrance of the strange lady is daily growing fainter? It looks very much as if that bright spark of romance has been extinguished. How can he hope to blow it into flame once more? Tony, the incomparable Tony, the man of many schemes, has nothing to suggest. He only says, "Patience," and Robert is growing restive. But why does Tony depart so far from his usual attitude as to say, "Patience"? As a rule, an adventure or an experience can hold him, but for a day or two. A week is almost unthinkable. And now, at the end of a fortnight, he still says, "Patience," unruffled, imperturbable, productive of threadbare platitudes as to the building of Rome, apparently hopeful. The simple reason is that Tony has not seen his card-dropping divinity again, and he hates being balked. In a word, the pair of them had waited, watched and spied, for 14 days without result. There had been night vigils as well as by day, but nothing had been learned. After dusk set in, they had sometimes watched for hours, Tony hiding in a ditch near the front gate, Robert at the back. The gossip of Miss Arkwright's nocturnal motoring had reached their ears, and they had built something on this, but never a motor had they seen approach the quiet house. One dreadful night they watched till dawn broke clear and stark, but 2 colds in the head were all that came to birth. Their watchings were a failure. Miss Arkwright and Billy might never have existed. The servants were useless. Only Forbes and the gardener issued from the quiet house after their day's work was over. Both were dumb. Incorruptible, too, for when the ingenious Tony produced a pencil and paper, meeting the gardener on the road as if by chance, holding half a crown for a lure, the man made signs that he could not use a pencil. Forbes was of stouter stuff. Tony waylaid him one evening at 9:30, thoroughly disheartened by this time, regretting that he had offered the gardener so small a sum, for he had afterward imagined that the man might have been playing a part. Tony unmasked his batteries. "Look here, my man," he said bluntly. "You are a servant at the quiet house. I want some information, and am willing to pay for it. If you'll just write down answers to a few questions, I'll give you a £5 note." Forbes' eyes glistened, and he took the pencil. Tony's heart leaped as he saw him diligently scribing. He snatched the paper and read, "I am sorry, sir, but I cannot write." Tony swore, as Forbes passed meekly on. He was not used to being beaten by a servant. Today they were at the vicarage for tea, and tea alone. The hospitable vicar had suggested dinner, lunch as a pis-aller, but his wife said no, and he was obliged to submit. The previous dinner had caused domestic friction, and Mrs. Peters did not mean to run any further risks. She was a lady who had the not wholly unworthy wish to make a fair show in the flesh. They entertained seldom, but when they did entertain, she was resolved to do things well. Soup, chicken, boiled or roast, cold lamb, palpably uncut and not an economical remnant to bring the blush, at least 3 sweets, and certainly cheese straws. These were the least a self-respecting woman could offer to the vicarage guests. The vicar, being a sensible man, would have been quite pleased to present, like Mr. Frohman, a simple meal. Soup, a joint with the usual supporters of potatoes and boiled celery. his own failing, a bramble tart, and a bit of Stilton. These were the cates he deemed worthy of kings. But the housekeeping pride of his lady forbade so inelegant a repast. "I like my guests to see that I know how things ought to be done and are done, Charles," she said in a final tone. "I will not have people saying that the vicarage and the rest." The vicar had given way with a sigh, reserving himself for the battle he knew must follow. It had come at once. Mrs. Peters, profuse to lavishness over the more solid items, betrayed a feminine false economy over the wine. There ought to be wine, of course. Though she was a teetotaler herself, still she knew that her guests should be offered the juice of the grape. But on the desirability of spending large sums for liquid that would vanish in a twinkling she held strong views. "You need not dream, Charles, of wasting money on expensive brands. I saw some invalid port at the grocer's this morning." But here her husband showed himself unusually pig-headed. He grew rigid at the words invalid port. "No, Clara," he said resolutely, "I won't have that at any price, even the grocer's. I believe in good things, or none at all. I'd sooner drink water than poor wine. We can't afford good port, but we can afford good whiskey or cider. Those it shall be." He was deaf to reason, though his wife begged him, with tears in her eyes, not to be so inconsiderate. Cider it had been, and Mrs. Peters had felt ashamed. The sight of 3 men quaffing deeply of the plebeian beverage gave no comfort. They were doing it to spare her feelings, of course, and she resented the unspoken charity. Besides, she did not greatly care about her guests. Mr. Wilde seemed singularly purposeless for a young man, and there was a half-veiled mockery in his speech that grated. Mr. Bangs was clearly of inferior breeding and did not seem at ease. He talked little and nervously, starting at the mention of his name. "He cannot have a past," thought Mrs. Peters grudgingly, "but he is certainly not used to the society of gentle people. I do wish Charles would not." The dinner was not a success, though the vicar enjoyed the postprandial smoke and small talk. So, leaving our muttons to return to them, they were at tea today. Or rather, they had finished tea and were taking idly on the lawn. The vicar was lying comfortably in a basket chair, trying to colour a meerschaum. Mrs. Peters was busy with embroidery. Tony and Robert in deck chairs were smoking too, contributing their quota to the conversation. To complete the picture, Brown, the odd job man, was delving holes destined to receive the posts of a pergola. Mrs. Peters' eye wandered from her work and dwelt frigidly on him. "By the way, Charles," she said, "did you ever speak to Brown about that young woman?" "What young woman?" asked the vicar lazily. Mrs. Peters recounted the incident. "No, my dear," said the vicar. "You could not tell me her name. All you had to go on was a voice, and I could hardly catechize him on that. Besides, it may be a worthy attachment." "Very possibly," agreed his wife, though her tone was sceptical. "I have no objections to that. But while he is at work—" "Awful word," said Tony, for the sake of saying something. "I wonder what work is like. Real continuous work, I mean." "We can offer you plenty," said the vicar cheerfully. "The lawn wants cutting. You could trim the hedge too, and—" "No thanks," said Tony with a shudder. "Any other time I'd be glad, but just now I'm too busy." "Of course, Mr. Wilde, my husband was joking. But don't you think that an idle life, would not work, literary work, for example, be a good thing for a young man?" "I'm too old to begin," said Tony wearily. "Now, a hearty young spark like my friend Bangs—" The spark flickered into a feeble flame of protest and died away. "You're wrong, Mr. Wilde," said the vicar, taking his pipe out. "Work is the best thing. You'd realise it if you tried it. Of course, now you're on a holiday." "Am I?" said Tony. "I'm a kind of bear leader to Bangs. I'm simply full up with work, looking after him, arranging schemes for his comfort, keeping him out of mischief." "Aren't I, Bangs?" Robert smiled in a deprecating way. You exaggerate a little, but Mrs. Peters disliked the cynical frivolity Tony imparted to the conversation. "Would you mind telling us the nature of some of these arduous duties?" she asked coldly. "Oh, there's a gay lot," said Tony, reflecting. "I've had to order lunch. For example, Bangs has no ideas. Then I organise walks and deal the hands at piquet in the evenings, and, by Jove, yes, I promised to help him telephone today, if you wouldn't mind." "Not a bit," said the vicar, the sole possessor of a telephone in Sherling. He rose and stretched himself. "Come along now." But Robert remained in his chair, looking decidedly uneasy. "No, no," he said with a frightened manner. "It is nothing. It will keep for a day or two. There is really no necessity." He began to stammer and blush, aware of the eye of Mrs. Peters. "You promised," said Tony reproachfully. Then turning to the lady he said, "Come, Mrs. Peters, you can't say that I lack energy now. Here am I, thirsting to get work, and old Bangs keeps me back. And only yesterday he said that nothing on earth should prevent him from at long last." "All right," interrupted Robert, in terror of what Tony would say next. Come along. Where is the telephone, Mr. Peters?" "In the dining room," replied the vicar, wondering. "I'll show you the way." They went into the house, leaving Mrs. Peters on the lawn, deeply stirred. "That man has a past," she determined. "He looks simply terrified. I wonder if I ought to ask Charles. I wonder if it would be right to. And they are strangers, one never knows." She thought sternly for a moment and then got up, resolution in her countenance. "It's a duty," she murmured, "a positive duty, and Charles is so weak." The martyr to duty was going to listen at the door. Chapter 18. TonyWorkAndAPlay. If the telephone had been in the vicar's study, Mrs. Peters might have watched in vain, for to acquire accurate information through a keyhole needs practice or unusually keen ears. But the vicar wanted perfect quiet to prepare his sermons, and it was agreed that the instrument should be placed in the dining room. This suited Mrs. Peters admirably, for there was a dumbwaiter between that room and the pantry. Standing on the other side of the hatch, which she raised with caution a couple of inches, she could hear all that passed, secure in the reflection that a screen concealed the hatch and butler's tray. This is what she heard as soon as the vicar had left the room. "Mr. Wilde, I told you that I would rather not." "Remember that. You've allowed your unhappy wife to mourn." No, I thought it better not to write just yet, in case. Pure funk and nothing else. No, Bangs, you ought to let her know. You ought to have let her know before this. Besides, there's no danger. She can't spot where you are." "Then there is a mystery," reflected Mrs. Peters, warm with the satisfaction of a justified eavesdropping. "He has left his wife." "Nen? No, but seriously, Bangs, you must telephone. Every day you delay brings a possible pursuit closer. Come now, shall I ring up?" No. Wait half a minute while I think of something to say. How shall I begin?" "Shall I? Oh, the usual sort of greeting from a husband to a wife. Good morning, little bunch of fluff. Or, cheero, beloved armful. Any pet name. Look here, you'd better let me—" A confused sound hinted to Mrs. Peters that a struggle for the receiver was in progress. It ended speedily in a victory for Mr. Bangs. His voice quavered a number, Bloomsbury 1843B. Mrs. Peters made a mental note. Hello, are you 8843B? Yes. Who's that? Hello, who's that? Oh, it's you, Jane, tell your mistress. Hello, you silly girl, it is me. She's had a fright, Mr. Wilde. I ought to have broken the news more gently. What? Do speak up. Yes, you sat down on the porcelain bowl on the hall table. Confound. What for, you clumsy? Oh, I frightened you. Oh, I see. Well, go on. Yes, no, perhaps it wasn't altogether your fault. Yes, all right, that's quite enough. I know you're sorry, yes. Tell your mistress I want to speak to her. She's in the kitchen. Well, go and fetch her. Don't hang the receiver up. Yes. She's gone to fetch her, Mr. Wilde. The plot thickens. Bangs, I say. Shall I take the receiver and telephone? Rather a lark, you know, your wife expecting you and hearing me instead. No. I won't address her in terms of affection if that's all you're afraid of. Besides, I should rather like to hear what she says to her peccant husband. Not for anything, Mr. Wilde. Hush, here she is. Is that you, Alicia? Wee. I'm exceedingly sorry, my dear. No, I wasn't laughing. Something wrong with the wire. Well, how are you? That's good. I do hope you haven't been worrying. What? Oh. She says I'm not worth worrying about. Cover it, UP, you fool. She'll hear you, eh? No, nobody else here, my love. Quite alone. The wire. What's that? Magnetic storm. Magnetic storm, Alicia. Plug's not firmly in, perhaps. Well, you're all right then. Anything else? Oh, me. Oh, I'm in capital form. What? Yes, that's all. What? Oh, I thought I'd better ring up to let you know how I was getting on. Yes, I shall come back presently. No, absolutely no. I can't possibly tell you my present address, but you needn't worry. I'm quite all right, eh? No, I'm not unfeeling. This is just my holiday. I shall be back in a few weeks. I send you my love. Goodbye. That do, Mr. Wilde? You might send a kiss, eh? Usual thing, try again. I bet she's not left the wire. Hello, you there, Alicia? I just rang up to send you a kiss. Goodbye. So we've set her mind at rest, Bangs. You lost your funk pretty soon. Well, Mr. Wilde, somehow it's not quite the same thing talking to Alicia from a distance, Talisha from a distance. I felt quite brave. Perfect hero. Now we've settled that, let's go and find the dragon in the garden. They found the vicar, but not the dragon, who was lashing her tail in the pantry, impotent, speechless, aflame with anger. To hear herself called a dragon, and by a pair of unprincipled adventurers. One of them, it appeared, was a man who had run away from his wife, the other, an idle fribble who might be anything. Thank heaven I have no daughter in the house, thought Mrs. Peters in a paroxysm of resentful propriety. Who could feel safe with such men about? And this comes of Charles picking up chance acquaintances in a common tavern. Oh, I must go and tell him, expose them at once, the impudent hypocrites. On the threshold she paused. Was it because, despite her justification, she did not feel anxious to mention the vigil in the pantry, or was it due to a wifely consideration for a husband's weakness? She chose to believe the latter. Charles will not have the moral courage to expel them from the vicarage, she reflected. He is pitifully craven in such matters. I must manage it myself. I had better wait and watch. They may have any designs. Perhaps I had better wait, and then, a smile, terrific in severity and menace, writhed her lips. Some signal act of vengeance was evidently maturing. Yes, I will wait. On the lawn she found Tony. Compelling herself to speak without undue hostility, she learned that the vicar had carried Robert off to inspect the greenhouse. Mrs. Peters, on the plea of a message, followed. She could not trust herself with Robert or his accomplice. Is it he who has led Mr. Bangs astray, or the other way about? She wondered viciously. They both seem to be most undesirable, but Mr. Bangs is older and ought to know better. Besides, he has a wife. Had she known of Tony's matrimonial vicissitudes, she would have fainted. The odd job man had just finished his digging, and Tony strolled over to exchange a word. He never despaired of finding interest in the most unpromising material. Chats with para-orators, enthusiastic Salvationists, members of the Junior Turf Club, constellations of the stage, even housemaids taking in the milk. All might be, and often were, instruments in the warfare against boredom. All were fish for his net, but it must be confessed that his catch had hitherto been of little value. He had bought a few centimes worth, paying for it with numerous rouleaus, and he was beginning dimly to wonder if it was not rather an extravagant method of exchange. Done? He asked laconically, and Henry Brown smiled with content. That's a good job jobbed, he replied. Shifting earth is healthy, sir, but it takes doing. Do you like it? Said Tony. I mean, do you find it interesting and all that, or do you pant after the higher life? More wages and less work and so forth, I mean. The odd job man shrugged his shoulders. It's my job, sir, he said philosophically. I can't say it's amazing interesting, but it's my job, and it's got to be done. Got to be done, repeated Tony, musing. I suppose it has by someone. Thank goodness it's not to be done by me. Tell me, Brown, what do you really think of work? Does it bore you or what? Do you think it's a good thing, so to speak? You needn't mind speaking out. The vicar can't hear, and I'm a man of the world and all that. Tell me, does work bore you to tears? The other smiled. Work's kept many a man straight, sir, he said. I should be sorry to be without. You really mean that? Asked Tony in surprise. I do, sir. Don't you think the same? Tony did not answer, but reflected for at least a minute. Then he took off his coat and turned up his shirt sleeves with a whimsical smile. I haven't worked for years, he said. Kept myself fit with developers and other horrors. Lend me your spade, will you? I want a new thrill. Brown laughed but obeyed. Tony began to dig, steadily and resolutely, at a spot where another post was to be planted. He did not attack the task too vehemently, as many an amateur would have done, for he had brains. But he dug faithfully, and at the end of 10 minutes he was more than hot. He did not give in, however, but dug on till the task was accomplished. Then he threw down the spade, wiped his forehead, and stretched himself. Brown watched him curiously. Had enough, sir? For the present, yes, said Tony. One mustn't suck pleasure to the dregs, but I'll admit it's not a bad sort of notion on the whole, this work. In small doses it might even be admirable, a kind of aperitif, you know, but, regarded as a habit, that would need further consideration. Where can I find a tap? Behind that fence, sir. Tony went to cleanse his hands, leaving the odd job man chuckling. Rum customer, he murmured. A very rum customer indeed. Oh, very rum. Everything's rum, when you come to think of it. More than rum. Things seem to get rummer every day. Tony thought the same as he stood drying his hands upon the grass and a handkerchief behind the fence. The tap was screened from the lawn by the aforesaid fence, from the road by the privet hedge. And as he dried and mused, steps, the light tapping of small feet, could be heard approaching on the other side of the hedge. From a subconscious strategy, caused by a deep-set mysterious instinct, he waited till the steps had gone past. Then he peeped through the hedge and nearly whooped. For, retreating, he observed the neat figure of his damsel of the visiting card. Joy was excusable, for he had not seen her again since their encounter. His first impulse was to whistle. This he checked on the score of vulgarity, and bethought him what course would be best. Should he break through a weak spot in the hedge, leaving Comrade Bangs to his own devices, or should he make formal but hasty adieu, and pursue in the hope of overtaking? The latter was clearly the more correct procedure, but Tony's heart yearned regretfully over the girl in the road. She looked such a perfect pet. Luckily he was not called on to make an immediate decision, for she stopped a few yards farther on and gazed around. Tony concealed himself in such a way that he might still keep an eye upon her. What was she waiting for? He was not left long in doubt, for she gave a low but melodious whistle. The whistle was answered in the same key. "Brown, by all that's wonderful," muttered Tony. The lucky dog, no wonder he doesn't find work dull. If he expected a love passage, he was disappointed. The girl, as soon as her whistle was returned, flung a piece of paper over the hedge and walked quickly away. Tony gave the odd job man time to pick up the billet and presently strolled round, still drying his hands. "Clean, sir?" asked the odd job man stolidly. After all, the privet was thick, and Tony might not have seen. "Yes, thanks. I say, Brown, I've been thinking over what you said about work just now. It seems to me that there's quite a lot to be said for it." "Yes, sir. I should like to know more. To hear a little more about the practical side of the question, before making up my mind as to its intrinsic worth. I wonder if he'd care to smoke a pipe and try the cider of the Happy Heart with me tonight?" "Thank you, sir," replied Brown, betraying no surprise, "but I'm afraid I'm too busy." "Tomorrow, then." "Busy tomorrow, sir, too." "Sunday an off day. To be frank, sir, I have a young lady." "Ah," said Tony, hoping to hear something. "I won't press you, then. I wish you luck." "Thank you, sir." There was a brief silence that Tony felt oppressive. He was the first to break it. "Been engaged long, Brown?" "No, sir, not very long." Another silence. The impenetrability of these yokels is not exhilarating. Tony felt chilled, disappointed. He tried again. "I suppose it's almost as engrossing as work, Brown." "Yes, sir, almost." He said it without a smile, as if he was quite serious, but Tony suspected him of being guileful. Clearly it was useless to prolong the conversation. He sighed. "Well, I must look for my friend. Goodbye, Brown. Do come and talk to me about work sometime, when the lady is otherwise engaged." "Thank you, sir." Tony moved off to find Robert. He was discovered in the kitchen garden, pretending to admire vegetable marrows. Mrs. Peters was hovering grimly in the rear, a silent, watchful figure. The vicar was dilating on the excellence of marrow jam. After saying goodbye, Tony and Robert went off to the inn. The vicar turned to his wife with a smile. "Quite a pleasant afternoon, my dear. I like Mr. Bangs. Mr. Wilde, too, is amusing, though cynical. But we mustn't judge too harshly. Perhaps he has had a disappointment and his cynicism is half assumed. Undoubtedly humorous and clever. Some of his shots hit the mark." "You think so?" said Mrs. Peters icily. "I dislike them both. Mr. Bangs, to say the least, is anything but quiet. Mr. Wilde, I am sure, is a man who has had a gentleman's education and lapsed. Superficially clever, perhaps, but vulgar. You made a mistake in taking them up." "No, no, my dear, be a little more charitable. A great mistake, Charles. But you always think you know best. What I insist on is principle. Nothing can compensate for the lack of that. Principle above cleverness." The vicar laughed good-naturedly. "Why, what a dragon of virtue!" He got no farther. Mrs. Peters suddenly assumed so dreadful an aspect that he shrank aghast and began to fumble for excuses. Chapter 19. THEPLOT again thickens. At the end of 3 more days, Lionel was feeling a little ill-used. There was still no word from Beatrice, and the watching brief he held began to look like a permanency. A sinecure, you remarked disparagingly, or, with an envious inflection, a soft job. And Lionel had a roof above him, luxurious food, money in his pocket, and a pretty hostess. He would be a churl who grumbled, a witless being who did not know when he was well off. But nevertheless he grumbled. He wanted to be up and doing. Dalliance was delightful, no doubt, and he could thoroughly enjoy so pleasant a pastime. But he required a soup-con of the serious to edge his palate for frivolity, and not a single olive had been sent him from headquarters. Beatrice might have written, surely, not necessarily a letter, but a note, a telegram, even a picture postcard was not too much to have expected. After all, he was a human being trying to do her a good turn. She might, if she liked, consider him in the light of a dog, but even a dog demands an occasional pat. Yes, Beatrice had been a little inconsiderate. When they met again, he would subtly convey that she had not been quite so perfect in her handling of the case as she might have been. And not blame. Oh no, that would be too severe. But a touch of respectful and adoring frigidity. A hint of polite and ardent disappointment. That was the note to be struck. It would add to the subsequent reconciliation, or rather readjustment. Iced champagne, in short, followed by liquor brandy. Finally, perhaps, who knows, a mixture of the two, compounding that exhilarating beverage, King's Peg. But that could only be drunk post-mortem. Poor, dear old Lucos. Well, for the present he must sport the blue ribbon. But a dog will have its pat. If the mistress will not give it, another may, and who can blame the devoted creature if it lingers piteously hard by a stranger? Again, why blame the stranger, moved doubtless by a kindly and an unselfish impulse? Why blame Miss Arkwright, in short, for growing daily more cordial, more appreciative, more anxious to oblige with the pat? Lionel was obeying the orders of Beatrice, to watch and do the bidding of his hostess. He could not be expected to damp her graciousness, check her enthusiasm. Had he done so, he might have sealed the source of some important information. He must endure the pat, suffer it, permit, accept, not refuse, but welcome. He was talking to her in the garden one afternoon. They had begun the conversation on some trivial theme, soon tossed aside for a subject of substance. It was not long before they were on the time-worn topic, the war of the sexes. Miss Arkwright, it appeared, was a suffragette, not militant certainly, but convinced and ardent. She expressed surprise that Lionel did not take similar views. "For you," she said sweetly, "are a reasonable, fair-minded man. And I should think," she added mischievously, "that you have many friends who might convert you." "It isn't my brain that wants conversion," he replied meditatively. "Most of the arguments are on the women's side. Logic tells me they should have the vote, feeling, and by feeling I don't mean prejudice or bigotry, but something deeper, recoils from the idea of women in Parliament, and it would mean that in the long run, let us keep them out of the dirty work. They might cleanse the stables. I'd rather not. We're cleansing them gradually, one hopes. At any rate, it's not a woman's job. Our view is that all jobs should be women's." "Impossible." He shook his head. "I'm one of the old-fashioned believers in the home as woman's sphere. And the thousands of unmarried workers? You forget them. Hard, I grant you, but they're a minority. Most women have the home sphere. Mind, I don't believe in inequality as regards laws. They should be the same for both." "Yes," she said with a bitterness that surprised him. "Look at the inequalities of divorce, for instance." "We'll discuss that presently. Look for a moment at the reverse of the medal. Hasn't woman got the pull and influence? Can't she sway men without the vote? A pretty woman or a clever woman can, not the others." "Yes, sex counts. So you leave us the weapon of the coquette. That's what it amounts to. Is that a desirable weapon?" "Besides, it's double-edged." "Rather a crude way of putting it," he said, a little uncomfortably. "Nature has given you a power you can use for good. Why not use it? But is it so powerful?" "On dit." "What do you think?" She bent forward, leaning to him, smiling audaciously in his eyes. Lionel would have been more than human if he had not felt flattered. This delightful creature, whom at a first meeting he had thought prudish and narrow, had developed amazingly. Companionship for a fortnight with a gay man of spirit and address, who did not lack a generous nature, had brought the bud to blossom. Now, as she smiled on him with inviting eyes, he felt strongly tempted to complete her education with a kiss. He temporized. "What does it matter what I think?" "It may matter a good deal," she said with a meaning he could not fathom. "Tell me." She explained herself curiously. Instead of speaking, she was silent for a moment, as if choosing a course. Then with a friendly abandon she rested her hands lightly on his shoulders and said, "No, you shall tell me." Then she waited for the inevitable kiss. Man is a strange animal. I apologize for this truism, but really, Lionel himself must be my excuse. A man may be a savage, a knave, a brute, but beneath every human bosom there lurk some seeds of nobility, however few and atrophied. Juvenile literature abounds with loci classici. The thief who breaks into the night nursery is subdued by the innocent prattle of baby Tompkins. The drunken ostler in the Pig and Whistle is sobered by the consumptive angel who lisps, "Daddy, dear Daddy, do come home." The blasphemous ravisher, mad in the hour of victory, is tamed by the sight of a locket. Heavens! How came this here? Tell me, girl. And drops his prey with an oath that is half a prayer. And so on, one need not accumulate examples. Lionel did not kiss Miss Arkwright. Though he had dwelt on the possibility, hoped for it, almost schemed and certainly desired, though he had decided that his grass bachelorship permitted such a kiss as was now offered, he refused. Why? Partly, no doubt, because a kiss won by half-forceful methods is worth more than a tribute freely offered. Partly because the offer tends to congeal the blood and curb the desire. The ideal has stooped and taken a few inches off her goddess statue. Partly, too, the moralist will be glad to note, because he remembered Beatrice. Seeds of nobility? One must suppose it. Perhaps a sense, dim recognized, that the cheapening of ideals by frequent draughts at wayside fountains lessens the value and appreciation of the ultimate prize. Men find it hard to resist a drink. If they could look forward with assurance to the final realization of their hopes, there would be fewer loveless marriages, fewer abandoned maidens, fewer degenerate men. But they feel that youth slips by. The ideal woman is hard to find, harder to win. Why not sip the peasant fountain that will slake them for a moment? So, vogue la galère. We will have one swig before we die. A good swig to drown regret. If we find it is not Veuve Clicquot but only muddy ale, at least we can get drunk on one as well as the other. These profound reflections did not present themselves so lucidly to Lionel as to the temperate reader who never gets drunk, never so much as sips. He comprehended them vaguely, unconsciously almost, in the thought, "Oh, damn, she's not Beatrice, I can't." A man of unsettled purpose, you perceive, who had mapped his course of pleasure and then forsaken it, vacillating, lukewarm, halting between two opinions. The evil that I would, I do not, he thought in humorous astonishment at himself, and then aloud, I am at a loss for words. He felt rather a fool, but was pleased to note that Miss Arkwright looked neither ill at ease nor disappointed. He searched her countenance for a hint of contempt, but found none. Dropping her hands with an unaffected laugh, she said, "You are duller than I thought, Mr. Mortimer. Come, let us go and see if they have brought tea out yet." They turned, and suddenly her face flushed scarlet. She drew in her breath sharply. Forbes was coming across the lawn, followed by the ambassador. She ran forward and shook hands, murmuring something Lionel did not hear. Then, as Forbes retired, she introduced the two men. Mr. Mortimer, Mr. Beckett. Lionel surveyed the ambassador with curiosity, his late-lulled suspicions once more awake. What was he doing here? Mr. Beckett returned the scrutiny, something in the manner of a jealous lover who would like an explanation of a stranger's presence. But he was a diplomatic gentleman, and it was with a slight laugh, merry and sincere, that he held out his hand. "We have met before," he said in a friendly fashion, "but under less happy auspices. Mr. Mortimer, you saw me under a cloud. I was exceedingly rude. You who are a golfer will readily find excuses, I hope. I am very sorry." Miss Arkwright's eyes looked anxiously upon them. When had they met, and where? How odd that he had never mentioned it once. She must hear the story of their meeting, and rude. What did he mean by that? Lionel smiled, and referred her to the ambassador. He, genuinely anxious to atone for a foolish contretemps, did not spare himself in the recital. Miss Arkwright laughed gaily over the tale. "Men are so silly," she said merrily as he finished. "Fancy getting angry over a game of golf, and all by yourself, too. If there had been someone to vent your rage upon—" "Alas, there was," said Mr. Beckett, with a whimsical glance at Lionel, who, despite himself and his suspicions, felt drawn toward the enemy. It was a friendly party of three that walked toward the summer-house. On the whole, tea was a successful meal. Miss Arkwright led the conversation, monopolized it, almost, hardly pausing for replies, agreement, or contradiction. She looked splendid, her colour heightened with pleasure, excitement, or kindred emotions. Lionel, who had studied her attentively for no short period, had never seen her in such a mood. She was gay and charming, unusually ready with the froth of sparkling small talk. Anyone meeting her for the first time would have believed her a clever flaneuse, a butterfly with brains and beauty, living solely for the moment. But Lionel, who knew her better and had some secret knowledge of her possibilities for intrigue and conspiracy, found himself questioning. Was she nervous? And if so, of what? Mr. Beckett had little opportunity to display his social gifts. The abilities, doubtless great to secure his present office, perforce lay hidden. But the few sentences he uttered, by way of confirmation or its opposite, were enough to show him as a man of original thought, some wit, and in close touch with the affairs of nations. An old man, he bore his years lightly, though the mask of frivolity he assumed out of compliment to his environment was occasionally dropped in moments of repose. At such moments he appeared tired, not physically, but of mundane trivialities. At last Winifred rose. "You know my routine," she said brightly to Lionel. "I must vanish speedily. No, don't move. Stay here and smoke. I shall escort Mr. Beckett." "You still, then?" began the ambassador, rising at the hint. She interrupted him brusquely. Still. Are we not always stilling? I wonder that a man of your experience finds anything remarkable in that." "Oh, do not interrupt," for he made a deprecating gesture, opening his mouth to speak. "I will hear no excuses for banality. The ringing grooves of change is pure fallacy. Change is absent, only the grooves remain. We are what we are. As it was in the beginning is now, and—" "Do I shock you?" she asked abruptly, turning to Lionel. "Surprise, not shock," he smiled. "Then you owe me a debt of gratitude. Surprise is one of nature's best gifts, but at our mature age she is parsimonious. Don't you agree, Mr. Beckett?" He, too, smiled, but mournfully. "I have more need to count my birthdays than you," he said. "If your surprises are few, how many can I hope for?" "Nil desperandum," she said cheerfully and less self-consciously, taking him comrade-like by the arm. "Come and find your motor. Perhaps a surprise is waiting. Some ragamuffin may have put a penknife through the tire." "I hope not," he said more briskly. "As it has only just come from London this afternoon to take me back after my holiday, I don't want to be balked at the outset. Well, goodbye, Mr. Mortimer." "Goodbye," said Lionel, shaking hands. "No chance of seeing you down here again presently, I suppose?" "Who knows?" said Miss Arkwright vivaciously, taking the words from his lips. "A dashing adventurer like Mr. Beckett, whose only serious business is golf." She did not finish the sentence, but let him off, protesting that the slander was ill-deserved. Lionel watched them disappear, heavy with thought. Miss Arkwright did not come back. He was glad of her absence, for he could only think, and think, and think again what it all meant, trying to find some key to the perpetual problem. There were Beatrice, Winifred, and the ambassador forever whirling through his brain, suggesting, perplexing, questioning. Where was the clue? If only he could put his hand on some definite idea, some shred of coherence in the whole amazing scheme. Beatrice had warned him that her sister and Mr. Beckett were conspiring. Good, that was definite, and the ambassador's visit was proof of fellowship. In what? High politics? The life of Lucos? It seemed so unlikely in this pleasant English garden, but the facts were stubborn. Then he had not heard from Beatrice. He had thought she and Winifred might be identical. Stay, he had discarded that. Let us begin again from another point. Why had Winifred invited his amorous interest? She, but Beatrice had warned him, unnecessarily, had been his foolish thought, against the wiles of Winifred. Her seductive friendship had been simply a trap. But no, the remembrance of his recent delectable danger, the sincerity of her love, the faith of her eyes, all denied a trap. Winifred could not be a conspirator. At worst, she must be a half-hearted conspirator who had begun to sympathize with her enemies. But if that were so, she must soon be on the side of Beatrice, of whom she would speedily be jealous. His brain reeled. The sum of his perplexed musings was that he must keep his eyes open, a poor result for so much mental effort. That, however, was all he achieved by dinner-time, and he supped small comfort therefrom. "I am not made for detective work," he reflected gloomily as he played with dinner. "I went into this adventure too light-heartedly. I thought it a game. So it is, and deucedly exciting now, but I don't seem to have mastered the rules. A blind man in a total eclipse, looking for something that isn't there. That's Lionel Mortimer, Esquire. Old man, you'd better have a drink." Sensations were crowding thick upon him. His uneventful fortnight was to bear a heavy interest within a few brief hours. In the library, after further futile pondering, he tried to distract his thoughts with books. It was a failure. He could not concentrate his attention on printed words for more than 5 minutes together. Always he came back to Beatrice and the ramifications reaching from Constantinople to London and thence to Sherling. With a grunt of dissatisfaction, he got up at last at 11 o'clock and knocked out his pipe upon the hearth. As he did this, he heard a slight crunch as of a foot upon the gravel. He turned quickly toward the French window and saw that he had forgotten to draw down the blind. He saw something else as well. For a brief second Lionel had a glimpse, the barest glimpse, of a white face pressed against the pane, watching. The face vanished almost before the retina had time to record the impression, but he knew two things at once. It was a man's face, and a man he had never seen before. Lionel did exactly what you and I would have done. He stood stock, still for a moment, his heart clop-cropping against his ribs, as if intent on bursting its way through to the light, hammering a Morse message. "You are badly frightened, you are badly frightened, you are badly frightened." "Yes," said Lionel, after 3 seconds' pardonable collapse, "I am, but I'll try to frighten the other chap." And with laudable swiftness he ran to the window, threw it open and called, "Who's there?" Of course there was no answer. With a thawing of the faculties he ran back, seized the poker and turned off the light. Then he stepped outside to look for the night prowler, longing for some tangible flesh to beat into a pulp. The night was starless. Not a breath of wind stirred the leaves. Not a bird twittered a hint of ambush. Not a sound on gravel or swish of dew-laden grass brushed by a spy's foot promised vengeance. Aglow with eagerness, now that action was possible, and a clue at hand, he walked round the house, eyes and ears alert for the marauder. There was nothing to be seen. It was only too clear that the watcher by night had escaped the moment he was seen, and no good purpose could be served by a random pursuit in the dark. Lionel went back to the library, secured the windows and lighted a fresh pipe. Of course he could not arouse the house. If, as seemed certain, this watcher were a Turkish spy, it would be absurd to enlist Miss Arkwright's aid. Better to say nothing, still watch, but even more narrowly, and go to bed. It was 11:45 when he went upstairs, still smoking. His bedroom lay at the end of a short passage. Anxious not to disturb anyone at that unseasonable hour, he took off his slippers at the foot of the stairs and advanced in his stocking feet. Without the slightest noise he tiptoed along the corridor. Just before he reached his room another door was opened, very quietly indeed, upon his right. A line of light cut the blackness, and Lionel stood still involuntarily, without purpose, waiting, expectant of something, he knew not what. The door opened wide, and a girl in a pretty pink dressing gown came out. It was not Winifred who threw up her hands at the sight of the waiting Lionel. It was Mizzy.